So this is part 2 of the esoteric and occult functions slash associations with homosexual behavior. We're going to pick up where we left off. So we finished talking about quote unquote esoteric slash sex magic. I know it sounds nutty, and it is. And we left off our discussion with Aleister Crowley. And so I just want to point out that in that book, that I referenced, it often makes it sound like, well, we don't really know if he was talking about human beings or if it was all theoretical. And this website provides you with his own writing of what he said himself and will highlight the relevant sections. This is what a person that thinks, deviant sexual behavior, including sodomy, deems is okay. Then we will look at one of the common terms or associations used for particular ritualistic practices, and it's not cited at all. Whenever you pull this stuff up, you'll see what I mean here in a minute when we go through it. So this symbology of the X symbol, how it's associated with this key of David type thing. But anytime you pull up an article or a source, it's just text. There's no citations. There's no place to look anything up. But we will, however, sort of compare the anatomical structure identified in the previous lecture in the Kundalini yoga part, saying that there's the structure at the base of the spine. And there, in fact, is. It's called by various names: the coccygeal body, the coccygeal ganglion, Luschka's body from the person that identified it in the 1890s. And we'll see that there actually is, as the esoteric tradition states there would be, a connection between this structure at the base of the spine, which the Kundalini people were trying to activate, the yoga people were trying to activate through various means, and is referenced multiple times in the esoteric literature, and it's connected with the sympathetic nervous system. This structure is associated with nerves that run up the spine, and it has a surprisingly large amount of acetylcholine in it. And we'll look at sort of some of the functions of acetylcholine, and some of this will be obviously speculative, but looking at, well, what kinds of things could potentially result from injury or trauma to this region. And in order to do that, we'll look at sort of the symptoms of what happens to male sexual assault victims, which is obviously a little bit different of a context because there's a difference between consensual and non-consensual as it relates to trauma, but ideas are all orbiting each other, and nobody's really attempting, partially because the subject matter is so dark. But if you have a mechanism by which, I'll just say it explicitly here, this lecture is not for kids. This lecture is for adults. You should have viewed the first lecture before viewing this one. So before I continue on, if you're not able to handle what's in the previous lecture, you're not going to be able to handle what's in this one, which is totally understandable. That's totally fine. Click off of the video. That's totally fine. You're responsible for the types of content that you're viewing and all this stuff. However, if there's a mechanism by which, are you ready? If there's a mechanism by which sodomy could be used to alter people's emotional states, to alter their perception of their sexuality, to alter their sense of masculinity, or create a trauma-based state in which a person is more suggestible, almost like a hypnotic state, then you could see from a pragmatic, albeit could easily argue evil, standpoint how useful this would be in the context of exerting control over other human beings. Because if you can crush somebody's masculinity, if you can crush their sense of their sexuality, and if you can put them in a fearful, anxious state, which in the transsexuality lectures, I talked about how anxiety states make people more suggestible, and things like PTSD and disassociation, all these sorts of things, trauma-based stuff makes people disassociate more. It disconnects them from reality. So you couple this trauma with things like psychedelics and all these other sorts of things, you're almost creating a recipe for a very unhealthy population, but a population that it's easier to dominate and control over. And that's ultimately what I believe the reasoning for the large push for homosexual stuff is to open the doorway not just for adult sexual relations, unfortunately and scarily, but now that they're pushing this minor attracted person stuff, if you can get access to children through this, it's game over. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, most people would get it, and this is why they're so, this right-wing conspiracy about groomers. No, this isn't part of an in-game plan, because if they can exert domination over children and we're not defending them, what's left? Nothing. They win. Opening the door for this was a profound mistake on every conceivable level, and I intend to establish that by looking at adult homosexual relationships primarily in subsequent lectures. But I do want to sort of tie these ideas together, because even for the people that can't handle this stuff, for the people that can, you have an obligation to defend what's right. And I don't care what your religious affiliation is, your atheist, your whatever else. Everybody deep down has to know that this is wrong. Everybody deep down has to know that this is wrong. And if you don't and you're trying to condone it, then you're my enemy. And I'll gladly pick up a sword to fight you. Be that as it may, once again, forewarned, let's continue on with this lecture. And so if you come to this hermetic library, which I don't recommend that you visit at all, and this is Magic Libra ABA Book 4, and this is written by Aleister Crowley. He references the golden bough and references this bloody sacrifice. He says the animal should be killed within the circle or triangle, or as the case may be, so its energy cannot escape. An animal should be selected whose nature accords with that of the ceremony. Thus, by sacrificing a female lamb, one would not obtain any appreciate quantity of the fierce energy useful to a magician who is invoking Mars. A ram would be much more suitable, and this ram should be a virgin. The whole potential of its total energy should not have been diminished in any way. For the highest spiritual working, one must accordingly choose a victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory. The bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious, and for nearly all purposes, human sacrifice is the best. The truly great magician will be able to use his own blood or possibly that of a disciple, and that without sacrificing the physical life irrevocably. So he's basically saying you can sacrifice people, students, what have you, in this instance, but he's not. He's saying in most cases, if you do it correctly, you shouldn't kill them. Okay, so again, still creepy as can be, still using his preferred choice as intelligent males, and given his preceding preponderance of using deviant sexual behavior, specifically homosexual penetration, it's not a reach to come to certain conclusions about why he might be highlighting specifically the use of young boys. So before we get into this stuff again, just want to direct you to this Occult Anatomy of Man, okay? And it shows the Temple of Solomon and all this kind of, and the Castle of Camelot, okay, and all this kind of stuff. And so we're interested in, unfortunately, this region, okay, the last vertebrae adjacent to the anus, and we talked about the Kabbalah tree or whatever, and Malkuth, which was said to be the same thing as the anus in the Wikipedia article, and then it's hard to see here, but it says the pubic bone. The image is higher quality in the previous lecture, and shin banda or something like that is also the anus. So there's this anatomical identification with this idea, unfortunately, scarily, between Kundalini yoga and the occult and all these sorts of things and the anus. And then we talked about the Manly P. Hall stuff, which literally referenced the city of Sodom when talking about it at the very beginning of the previous lecture. And so that brings us into, I know, scary stuff, this discussion. So in tandem with this concept, you'll necessarily come across the idea of ritual abuse. And there is this idea of a key of David being associated with sodomy. Everything that you search for basically are replications of the same article over and over and over and over again. And it basically suggests some sort of mind control operation, and basically says there's a nerves at the base of the spine that's caused something neurological to happen with the brain. For a person to be able to develop multiple personalities, they would have to be attacked between the ages of 2 and 4, and you can develop multiple personalities. It is called the Key of David, and they're saying all this stuff about it being associated with ancient Egypt. They affiliated with Freemasonry and all these other things, but they don't provide any real sources ever on this. And you'll see it replicated, this article or some variation of it replicated over and over and over again. But the concept is interesting, albeit gross, because of the relevant anatomy that they seem to be describing in this scenario. Interestingly, if you just look up the symbol X in Open Scroll, it talks about multiplication and pyramids, and Christ is in Xmas and all this kind of stuff, Generation X, X chromosomes, Xbox 360. And it also references the Illuminati and shows witches crossing their fingers and the cross shaking of hands of all these wealthy people and all this kind of stuff. And that the double X is often used in the occult. And you see this unicursal hexagram that's similar to what we saw in the Aleister Crowley article. And they also reference the hermaphrodite Baphomet. And just randomly, amongst all this stuff, the X can symbolize the anus, the portal of transformation in ritual or key of David sodomy. It's just randomly positioned there with no citations or sources or anything. So I'm not really willing to spend a ton of time trying to look into this to state that there's a considerable amount of individuals practicing esoteric thoughts, ideas, and traditions that believe that sodomy is a ritualistic means by which to achieve their goals. Apologies. I understand how gross, unappealing, and all that kind of stuff. Again, like I said, only watch it one time and then have an understanding of it and then be done with it. And interestingly, on YouTube, I mean, these are all small followings, but we do see these people that are popping up on YouTube talking about the connection between, using homosexuality, gay, pagan magic, Wicca, love spells, witchcraft, and all these sorts of things, trans stuff. And this person talking about Crowley. So there is this sort of marketing that is at least in the beginnings of taking place, even on platforms like YouTube, for this role of homosexuality with ritual magic. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is something that every homosexual person is into or that produces homosexuality in and of itself. But given some of the stuff that we're going to look at, it bears worth pointing out that it seems to have a significant appeal for at least a subset of this population. And also to point out that in the first transgender/transsexual lecture on the esoteric, it was mentioned explicitly that in many of those cultures in Native America and Africa and a lot of those places, that the individuals that practiced basically transsexual behaviors or homosexual behaviors were often put in positions of leadership as shamans. So there's this weird, these people see visions type of thing. They have a special difference because they have the soul of the opposite sex inside of them stuff. Again, all that was covered in the first transsexual lecture. I know this is, nutty stuff we're talking about here. There's been this long-standing association with out of the norm sexual behavior and quote unquote magical or esoteric influences. This has a longer history than I think a lot of people are willing to acknowledge on the outside, but on the inside, a lot of these groups celebrate it. And as power dynamics continue to change, who knows what sorts of things will start to manifest on a larger scale within our culture. Now we're going to get into the male sexual assault literature. So why am I showing you this? Okay. It's very difficult to tease out potential effects that both psychological and physical that sodomy can have on human beings. Okay. And it's obviously going to be different in the form of sexual assault than consensual stuff. And again, continuing to issue multiple warnings throughout the lecture, of which you issued warnings at the beginning of the lecture. One, we're going to look at this paper's from 2023. How come we know so little about this effect for men? And this is where, I do give some points to the red pill people. Although I think ultimately that movement has been popularized and algorithmically enhanced because they're trying to control population metrics. And also, if you can't get along with women, if they're basically pushing, division between men and women, well, it's probably going to lead to, at least on some level, an increase in homosexual behavior. But I digress on that. But to their credit, the fact that we're in 2023 and they're still like, well, there's so much we don't know about male sexual assault, it kind of speaks to this, and we'll touch on that. I mean, there was some literature that was started in the 1970s, and then it kind of went away because I don't think that they want the general public to have an understanding of what happens to men who have been forcibly victimized in this way. And so we'll look at one, we'll see even peppered throughout this thing, they're wanting to make sure not to have you forget, because this is 2023 after all, how bad victimization is for women, which of course it is. We're not, just because we want to focus in and talk about one particular issue doesn't mean we're denying any other issues. And I believe in this review they're going to mention assault against people of color and all these sorts of things. It's okay, but let's focus on the issue at hand first. So we'll see just how difficult it is to get information on this. Obviously, men don't want to report it. But what we'll also see in this literature as we go through it is, one, it's going to give us an opportunity to compare a group of people that are underserved, victimized, we've known about for years, and do make up a significant percentage of the population, yet haven't gotten even a fraction of the media coverage of transsexuals. These people have high suicide rates. These people have all sorts of problems. None of this is their fault. None of this is a choice. And yet the media has chosen to cover, the fact that in 2020, 43 transsexual people were killed. So it's like, okay, but we don't even have an idea of how bad this problem is. And we've been studying it since the 1970s, and it's hard to get funding for research. So if it was just about social justice for the most underserved groups, why are we not talking about this group? But second, to see that there's profound psychological impacts that indicate that there to this activity, that indicate that, one, there are traumatic, disassociative type effects that can disconnect people with reality, which is sort of in keeping with the sort of key of David thing. And that if you're doing this, as scary as it sounds, to children while they're still developing, their brains haven't even formed, how horrific is that? Because in even adult males, we'll often see that they start to question their own masculinity and sexuality as a result of this. And then we'll tie that into the anatomical structure we identified in the first lecture in the Kundalini yoga thing. There's actually been an organ of Lushka that was identified in the 1800s that is structured exactly like what was described in the yogic and the Kabbalah stuff and the Manly P. Hall esoteric body of man stuff. And it has this intimate connection with your central nervous system. And also your immune system and norepinephrine and adrenaline and all these sorts of things. Why is it that this area and the area related to that specific anatomy is so grossly understudied in the medical literature? Because typically when you find something novel, you want to flesh it out because there's a race to see who can be the expert on a relatively unexplored area, or who can produce the most cited person on a particular topic. So whenever you see a dearth of research on something, or you see that research studies are being conducted the only ones available are being conducted in a biased way, it tells you that there has to be something about the power structure that's causing this to be the case, because we've already seen massively small percentages of the population excessively overrepresented when it fits a certain agenda and based on victimhood. Yet in this particular instance, we're not seeing that. And I am arguing that it would give us indications that the stuff that they were attempting to do in those esoteric traditions and the stuff that they're trying to cover up now have an anatomical basis for why we're seeing the effects that we're seeing in these victims. Okay, so that's why I'm showing you this. Again, this is not pleasant stuff. Again, just watch these 2 lectures one time. You don't need to watch them ever again after that. This isn't stuff to dwell on. This isn't stuff to obsess over. But there needs to be a subset of the population that's aware of this. We can adequately defend ourselves from the stuff that's coming and understand why it's so essential to defend ourselves. And further down the rabbit hole we go. Male victims of sexual assault. Review of the literature. Literature addressing male rape victims remains a growing area of interest in counselors and scholars. This article aims to review the growing literature on male sex assault victims. According to current estimates, over 27% of men and 32% of women have been sexually victimized at some point in their lives. So there's only a 5% difference. Molestation is a term used to describe a single incident of sexual assault on a young child, whereas sexual abuse is a term used to describe patterns of repeated sexual assault. Sexual abuse can have catastrophic or pervasive repercussions. Men are generally seen to be less affected by sexual victimization. There's evidence to support the idea that sexual victimization affects male victims mentally just as much as it does female victims, and may even be linked to worse results. Well, why? Because, if you failed to protect yourself in this way, or you've been violated in this way, you're not a man, right? That's the mentality that's going to be there. So not only were you raped and assaulted and, had something happen against your will, but on top of that, you've been emasculated. So for women, it's obviously a terrifying, horrific experience for them as well. But as far as their female identity is concerned, they're not going to think of themselves as being less feminine per se. Although they may want to react by becoming more masculine or something to that effect. Despite the social stigma against sexual violence, and then they go into this stuff here. So this is supposed to be an article on male sexual assault, and then in their preamble they include how awful sexual assault is for women, specifically African American women, and that there was no repercussions for them and all this kind of stuff, which obviously sexual assault against anybody is horrific, but you'll see kind of peppered throughout this thing, even though they present evidence that this really destroys men's lives and also like almost nobody cares, they still continue to pepper in all this stuff about female sexual assault victims to make sure that we don't feel too bad for men or something like that. I don't know. I don't think there's anybody that thinks sexual assault against women is okay. So there's just this weird kind of back and forth comparison where, yeah, well, also it's still horrible for women. It's like, we know it's horrible for women, but let's address this issue. Due in part to the misconception that ejaculation after assault constitutes permission, the legal system has been reluctant to offer male sexual assault victims a legal redress despite the increased awareness of the crime. So he's referencing historically, sexual assault against women wasn't prosecuted to the level that it should. And now they're saying, well, even in contemporary times, men's issue still isn't taken seriously. The literature unanimously agrees there's a dearth of information on the subject when compared to information on female victims. So you could argue that, and I think truly, that we care way more about female victims than male victims. I care more about female victims than male victims, and I'm male, and I'm aware of this issue. Maybe we need to do some reframing for people when 27% of the male population has been victimized to kind of redress this issue. Much of the literature is old, dating back to the 1970s when research was taking place. So in other words, nobody cared about male rape at all until after the 1970s. And it's only been sparsely carried over the last 50 years. This is from 2023. So in 2023, we're starting to open up the conversation about male rape. Given the lack of research into adult male sexual victimization, we do not have certainty regarding what is applicable to today's victims and what is outdated. They go on to define this stuff. They see a dramatic increase, although not very many men, in St. Mary's Sexual Assault Referral Center in Manchester, UK. It doubled. At first, fewer than 30% of men who were sexually assaulted were referred by police, whereas this number was over 70% in 2002. It's difficult to obtain accurate statistics. Several factors include definition limitations. These include sampling methods, unrecognized assault, and the prevalence statistics for adult men as a whole found that it ranged in 2004 from 0.6 to 8.3%. But when you survey men, what do they say? Well, it's closer to 27%. So in other words, the overwhelming majority of men are just never going to talk about it. National crime statistics show 10% of rape victims, or 1 in 33 men, have experienced rape, although the rates of the reporting of unwanted sexual contact have been reported in ranges of 38 to 48% for male college students. Incidents approximate 4% in most studies. So, in other words, at a particular age where males are generally more vulnerable, exposed to more social, environmental stuff, more alcohol, all those types of things, they're more likely to experience this. And again, older generational males, they're just never going to talk about it. They're not going to reference this at all. Percentages of violent victimization reported to police was higher for female victims than for male victims. The difference can be largely attributed to reporting of simple assaults. Additionally, male victims reporting unwanted sexual contact or pressured intercourse have been reported in ranges of 36 to 46%. Among male prisoners, 59 reported some form of childhood sexual abuse. So you think about it, males that are being sexually abused are disproportionately represented in the prison system. It is likely, however, that documented rate is an underestimation of the magnitude of the problem. Clearly, 7.4% of male students, 15.5% of sexual minority, and 6.5% of heterosexual students reported having been the victim of sexual victimization at least once in the previous academic year, meaning that homosexual, bisexual people are more likely to be victims of sexual assault. And so how this will always be framed is that the LGBTQ people are more victimized, and the question is, who's victimizing them, though? Because their relationships, their friendships, etc., are going to be disproportionately LGBTQ relative to the heterosexual population. And this is an argument that we'll see many, many times over, that we don't know who's doing more male-on-male sexual assault, if it's homosexuals or heterosexual men. And there's this weird defining thing, because the people will often say, well, males in a heterosexual relationship could just be pretending and actually be homosexual. But when it comes to sexual assault, how do you define somebody as being heterosexual? Are you just asking the victim if they think the person's hetero? Because if they're sodomized, that means the person had to be aroused, and our metric for measuring homosexuality is that they respond to homoerotic images via a penile plethysmography, so their blood flow that occurs. I know this is vulgar, I apologize for this. Again, warnings at the beginning of the lecture, this is not a pleasant thing to talk about in any way, but that's how they're gauging homosexual arousal, is that you're exposed to some form of homoerotic imagery versus hetero imagery, and your physiology responds. So necessarily, you're in order for your physiology to respond sufficient to assault another human being, something would have to be going on there. Or there's an aggression-based circuit that we will talk about that is promoting the arousal that has nothing to do with being attracted to one sex or the other. In any event, is anybody going to suggest that more heterosexual to engage in sodomy with another male than homosexual? Because that's essentially what the argument is. It's just as much hetero, guys, and that it just doesn't make any sense to me that you can be making that argument.
Now, this is just an introduction to this literature, okay? I will, in future lectures, address the points and counterpoints associated with this, and there are specific neurological responses that I'm going to point to, which makes this whole story more complicated, but it gets into how we're defining basically homosexual behavior in the first place, which I aim to prove is abnormal behavior. I aim to prove specifically in men that homosexual behavior is abnormal behavior and is not beneficial to the participants or to society writ large. So obviously I haven't gotten that far into it. And we'll see subsequent literature that shows that, and I'll talk about this in future lectures, that basically when you look at a population-based standard, heterosexual individuals are disproportionately negatively affected by this, and that the evidence of heterosexual perpetrators is just basically based on victim interviews half the time, and the other half of the time, well, not even half the time, but another significant percentage of the time, they're just interviewing the perpetrator and saying, are you heterosexual? And so, I mean, if you're trying to cover up your latent homosexuality or homosexual desire through aggression, then are you going to define yourself as being homosexual? No. So they're not going back and doing penile plethysmography on their people. It's literally just interviews, and they're taking their word for it that they're heterosexual, which is, again, we'll tease this out here too, because what's oft cited as, oh, well, I forget what serial killer it was, but, he started, tying up men and killing men because he was gay and his dad didn't approve of his homosexuality, so he just became a serial killer. And there's an entirely different set of neurological circuitry that makes certain things possible that I haven't gotten to yet. So if there's points in this that you're like, I don't know about this, or I disagree with your interpretation, I think they're just a bunch of hetero guys that are homophobic, that are, whatever else the story is. It's a more complicated story than most people think, and the basic explanations that we're getting are entirely insufficient. I'm just pointing to the fact that the evidence that says that it's heterosexuals perpetrating all these homosexual rapes is literally just based on interviewing the person, and their perception is that the person that raped them was hetero, or in some instances where it's possible, interviewing the perpetrators after the fact, and they're saying, oh yeah, I'm hetero, I'm totally straight.
Men may choose not to report if they have issues with their sexuality. Men are more likely to encounter reporting issues related to their sexuality, given they are more likely to be victims of other men. Men who have not publicly acknowledged that they are anything other than heterosexual may choose not to report for fear of having to come out. So again, you're saying all this stuff. There's all this confusion about who is or isn't homosexual here, but yet you're confident in other areas you'll be confident in saying, we don't know how much of it is heterosexual men doing this versus homosexual. And they said heterosexual men who are assaulted by other men might not come forward for fear of having their orientation revealed, and also the stigma that by public health care professionals that men cannot be raped. And this is something that you actually will have people see. And men will often opt not to complain. Mixed results have been found regarding the extent of violence as a factor in reporting. Fraser found that reporting to medical services typically required extreme circumstances such as gang rape. In contrast, Monk, Turner, and Light found that men who experienced penetration were markedly reluctant and less inclined to report the assault. The major reason why I'm showing you this stuff is we don't have physiological data to understand what is happening to men, and the reason that I'm emphasizing men is because their sexual assaults are necessarily going to be, if penetrative, sodomy, versus with females, it could be either or. And we often don't have data on either one. I get it. I know this is not comfortable stuff. This is gross stuff, but it'll come to a head here when we get to the end here. Some individuals think that rape is an act of dominance and control towards women, which prevents men from declaring themselves to be sexual victims. Male victim bias perpetuates victim blaming. The acceptance of male rape was a strong predictor of victim blaming, suggesting the acceptance of stereotypical ideas about male rape means the patient is more likely to engage in male rape victim blaming. Falsehoods regarding male rape are accepted widely, as confirmed in a study with high levels of misconceptions or false beliefs on male rape. Another related misconception is men are sexually assaulted by homosexuals. They're perpetuating the false belief that sexual violence is about sex and only committed by homosexual men, and victims are primarily homosexual. When we look at this data, we'll see that when it comes to like pedophile encounters and stuff like that, this is disproportionately homosexual. Again, how are you defining heterosexuality here? Are you polling these people? He seems straight, he was married, therefore he must be heterosexual. Because we don't accept that in any other domain. Where is the heterosexual thing coming from that it's heterosexual men that are purporting to engage in this? It is often thought that women do not assault men, leaving the perpetration of male sexual victimization to men. That is also true. Actually, there are a lot of women abusers out there. Accepted stereotypes that homosexuals solely assault men and only gay men are victims. The only gay men are victims thing is absolutely not true. But again, how are you defining homosexuality here? Struckman Johnson Associated found that 20% of those anonymously surveyed reported having been forced to have at least one sexual contact while incarcerated, included intercourse, vaginal, anal, oral, and sexual touching. Findings regarding sexual violence against men during incarceration vary greatly. Struckman and Johnson reported higher rates of sexual assaults were found using anonymous surveys and lower in those studies used in interviews. If they can maintain anonymity, they're more likely to be honest. So there's a back and forth about victim blaming here, which I think both things do unjustly happen to both men and women. Accordingly, participants found heterosexual male rape as more disgusting for homosexual men and women because it deviated from normative heterosexual practice. Tendency of the public to blame victims is not unique to men, but appears to exist at higher rates. So there's conflicting evidence on that, but it does seem that if you're a man and this happens to you, you're probably not going to get that much sympathy. You're probably not going to get that much help. There's a decent chance you're going to get called a homosexual, even if you aren't. What kind of characteristics are there? Adult men who are victimized are aged from 20 to 30 years old, were predominantly white, and considered vulnerable. Again, they don't really go into who is doing the victimizing here, but they're saying that white males tend to be disproportionately victimized. Now, we will go into this in more detail in forthcoming lectures. This is not the be-all, end-all of this data. We're skimming through this to see what kind of effects that we're observing in a certain population of people, and then we're going to get to the effects of the physical act on these individuals. But we will circle back to a more detailed examination of this data at a later date. Studies are mixed on whether or not homosexual or heterosexual men are likely to be victimized. There's a relationship to alcohol, positively related to alcohol risk. Men who drink a lot are more likely to be victimized. Male subjects are more subjected to violence, strangulation, restraining, slapping, kicking, biting. Male victims more often experience sodomy and are forced to perform fellatio as well as genital touching and cunnilingus. So, in other words, why am I showing you the male stuff, as gross as it is? Because we know that they're more likely to be penetrated in this way. So the effects on males are more likely to be representative of what is happening in this process. A quarter of men experience some sort of sexual violence in their lifetime. Includes rape, being made to penetrate an individual, sexual coercion, or unwanted contact. Use of weapons range from 5 to 50%. They're less common when the offender is known to the victim. And according to qualitative research on abusive gay relationships, psychological abuse is frequently presented alongside physical and sexual assault. And that's references 21, 118, 119, 120, and 121. Again, we'll see there's this disproportionate level of certain behaviors in homosexual relationships. It's so funny to me that we're not sure who's more victim, hetero or homo, but, we're not sure who's more of a perpetrator, hetero or homo. And the whole thing is, how are you defining heterosexuality if they're able to achieve arousal with another male in this instance? So again, if it's an aggression circuit-based thing that they're saying, well, it doesn't even have anything to do with homosexuality. Okay, then there's another circuit promoting arousal for sodomy that needs to be looked at in connection with homosexual behavior. Because are we going to argue that a male sodomizing another male is not homosexual behavior? If that's not homosexual behavior, what is? Even though several forms of abuse were considered in certain studies, only one prior study established association between various forms of abuse. There's a moderate strong relationship between victimization reports of various forms of abuse in a small convenient sample of gay men. Emotional impact on victims. And so this is the crux of what this does to other human beings. In the search focusing on male sexual victimization, distinct differences between male and female survivors begin to emerge. Men may experience a profound emotional disruption. Psychologically, victimization is especially trauma-producing for men. Walker and colleagues interviewed 40 male rape survivors, leading to detailed and descriptive analysis on the impact of the assault on men. Men reacted with freezing, fear, helplessness, and submission. About 27 reported they fought back without success. They had both short and long-term effects. Higher rates of mood disturbances, anxiety, suicidal ideation and behavior, non-suicidal self-injury, grief and loss reactions, drug abuse, sleep difficulties, sexual difficulties, increased change in self-perception, social dysfunction, stigma, shame, lower self-esteem, hostility, fantasies about revenge, and an increase in a sense of vulnerability. That's references 41, 53, 56, 57, 58, 89, 116, 123, 124, and 125. Post-traumatic stress disorder and rape trauma syndrome have also been noted. Self-blaming also affects how people respond to the victim, being perceived as less well-adjusted and more responsible for the rape than those that have not. Okay, so we've known about this for decades, and we've looked at interviews and all this kind of stuff, and we have pretty high rates actually of reporting, much higher rates of sexual assault victimization on the rate by males when you really look at the data, higher rates of victimization of sexual assault by males than are commensurate with the number of transsexuals in the population. And prior to 2020, and many of these studies were prior to 2020, we have higher rates of sexual assault and rape for men than the number of homosexuals in the country. And looking at the fact that it causes all these negative things, drug abuse, grief, loss reactions, and this population has been staring us in the face for forever, really. Why is it that we didn't spend more time on this? Why did we spend 100 years trying to convince people to care about transsexuals, and we spent 200 years trying to get people to care about homosexuals, but just male rape in general? Yeah, we kind of started talking about it in 1970, and here in this review in 2023, it devastates men in all these negative ways, but we're just now starting to get an understanding of it. So we know 100% that surgery and hormones help transsexuals from Harry Benjamin's data, except for if you went back and watched all my transsexuals, you'd know that's not true. And all the best evidence says it either stays the same or gets worse. And there's negative health consequences of the surgeries. And there's negative health consequences of the hormones. So if it was just about helping people who've been victimized, if it was just about helping with societal stigma, right? If it was just about improving people's lives, why aren't we as a society or culture, why isn't this plastered all over the news? Why isn't there a male sexual assault victim on the cover of Vanity Fair talking about why this is a huge issue. I already showed you the number of murders of trans people in the entire United States for the years of 2020 and 2021. It was 42 one year and I believe 30 the second year. In the entire population, that's the murder rate. And we've seen the rates as high, total population, somewhere between 8%, but around 27% are lifetime reporting some level of sexual assault. But we're willing to, on a fraction of a population, we need to upend all of society to make sure that they feel comfortable, that homosexuals feel comfortable, that transsexuals feel comfortable. But just men in general, when the assault rates clearly were higher than the percentage of homosexual people, the people being assaulted, clearly higher than homosexual, just based on epidemiological data, what are we doing here? Many men feel less masculine and assume they must be gay for another male to sexually assault them. Sexual dysfunction is common. Similar problems associated with male to female rape. Impotence, anxieties over sexual activity, increased promiscuity with women as a means of validating their sexual identity. Men report poor physical health than those who have not been victimized. Numerous somatic symptoms, including tension headaches, nausea, colitis, constipation, incontinence, decreased appetite, and sexually transmitted infection. So, what happens to men after they've been sexually assaulted? They potentially feel less masculine, so more commensurate with the ideas of transsexualism, and they're more likely to consider themselves that they must be homosexual. So if you're a homosexual and you wanted to increase the pool of other potential homosexuals, what kind of activities are you going to participate in? And if you're trying to exert your will over society, if you're trying to emasculate men in general, what sorts of activities are you going to try and encourage? Because we know this is the response, albeit it's different when it's consensual versus non-consensual. But if it's consensual, that means that they're already homosexual identifying or bisexual identifying. It changes your perception of yourself. Sodomy changes your perception of yourself. It causes all sorts of problems. It causes problems for their heterosexual relationships. And they have noted here, guess what also happens? They often start acting more promiscuous. So when we've seen how devastating promiscuity is in the relationship lecture. So what about these activities was so evil for people in the past to want to restrict them? And so when you see all this stuff about, assault-based mind control or assault-based whatever, well, this is sufficient enough for men to question their own sexuality after having this forced on them. So if you don't think that there's a methodology to the Epstein-Sandusky level, finder's case level, where you see all this abnormal behavior in people afterward. Further, if you look up rape trauma syndrome, experienced by survivors, that includes disruption from normal physical, emotional, cognitive, and interpersonal behavior. And you have these stages that include dulled sensory and memory functions, diminished alertness, vomiting, nausea, paralyzing, anxiety. So again, we see anxiety is more suggestible makes individuals more suggestible, just like we saw in the transsexual lectures. Hysteria, confusion, bewilderment, acute sensitivity to the reaction of other people. And you see the minimization, dramatization, suppression, explanation, other coping mechanisms, helplessness, continuing anxiety, mood swings, anger, insomnia, flashbacks, disassociation, feeling like one is not attached to one's own body, reliance on coping mechanisms such as self-harm, drug, or alcohol abuse, lifestyle, sense of personal security, feel hesitant to enter new relationships, questioning their sexual identity or sexual orientation, more typically of men raped by other men or women raped by other women. There is an aggressive component to homosexual behavior that, again, I'm just reinforcing this here, results in a sort of suggestibility / epiphany phase in which individuals could potentially impose the idea of changing your sexual orientation on people. Their regular relationships become disturbed and often report inhibited response and flashbacks to the rape during intercourse. Sometimes they become hypersexual or promiscuous. So what's that going to do? That's going to impair healthy relationships, and that's also going to result in potentially hypersexual behavior, which is associated with disinhibition. And again, I'm going to link these ideas together because you might be again saying this is unfair. You're comparing, rape to homosexual behavior in the first place. Well, first of all, in the esoteric tradition, they've established all this stuff about basically sodomy being used in all these rituals, and that homosexuality is in many cases superior to heterosexuality, more natural than heterosexuality. So they've linked these ideas beforehand. And if they're doing this stuff ritualistically, which in the case of Aleister Crowley, we know that he was, we know that can cause all these things like flashbacks, disassociation, etc., etc. And it also ties back, I think, to the promiscuity lectures. And we saw it whenever we were looking at the relationship stuff and the potential of recovering from promiscuity. And the reason why promiscuity in general is a bad idea. Yes, rape is different, but if you don't think that people would have issues potentially flashing back to former relationships while in their next relationship with intimate activity, you're being a little bit naive, which is why we see better relationship outcomes for individuals that are not promiscuous, and the best with individuals that have only been with the partner that they're married to. Am I saying all homosexual activity is the same thing as rape? No, I am not saying that. But what we will touch on in forthcoming lectures is the overwhelming majority of sexual assaults against men, at least from some data, indicate that there is sodomy that does take place, and that as a result of this, it causes them to question their sexual orientation. And so having established that, with a promise that in the future lectures we're going to tease these details out more because we had a very incomplete picture, and having established this about the dissociative states of rape trauma syndrome and its impact on behavior, we'll go to forthcoming lectures that look at the connections between, pedophilia and this type of stuff, unfortunately, and the rates of assault at a younger age in individuals in this community, which could predict some of these behaviors. We'll also look at neural correlates and environmental factors and all the same stuff we did in the transsexual stuff. But now having looked at that, now we're going to return to where we started with the esoteric stuff. We looked at the occult anatomy of man, and now we're going to look back at the direct anatomy of man and make some connections. So starting with the sympathetic ganglia that is connected to the organ of Luschka that sits at the base of the spine. So we'll define some anatomical things, and then we're going to look at the potentiality for some of the effects that we're observing that could potentially cause some people to have their behavior modified in a way which could make them easier to control.
What is the organ in question here that we're talking about? Well, here's one study, hematopoietic role of Luschka's coccygeal body. What they did was they looked at the glomulus coccygeus, described in 1860 by Luschka. Now I'm going to show you a picture here. This is what we're talking about, and it's this bulb, essentially, that is positioned at the end of the coccyx, at the end of the spinal column, the seat of power or whatever they were talking about. And you can see that the position of this organ can change anatomically based on the individual. So for some people, this is going to be, I hate to say it, more susceptible with certain physical acts than others. So on the anterior face of the last coccygeal body, a few millimeters of tip of the bone, anterior part of the tip of the bone, posterior part of the tip of the coccygeal body, retrococcygeal position. And what they found was they were looking at these blood leukocyte levels. So they were looking at white blood cell levels and temperature and dopamine release and all this kind of stuff. And what they did was they performed a surgery where they took the organ out versus doing a sham surgery, and the effect was significant for 65 days. So leukocytes, monocytes, and granulocytes did not show any variation. The amount of norepinephrine, adrenaline, and dopamine seemed to be decreased versus in the removed group, while the difference was less evident between the sham surgery. There was this change in norepinephrine, adrenaline, and dopamine that was significantly observed with removal of this organ, which is interesting because you think of what all those chemical compounds can do in the body, and they're systemically dropping by removing this tiny little bulb at the end of the coccyx. Luska's coccygeal gland, or glomulus coccygeum, was normally measured several millimeters in diameter. It is located at the soft tissue at the tip of the coccyx, was described the first time by Hubert von Luschka in 1859. In different species of mammals, man included, both glomerula and coccygia and glomerula caudalia may show some vessels which form a link between arteries and veins. They often consist of convoluted vessels and vessels that do not join a vein. It does not increase in larger species. In fact, short-tailed species such as rabbits, guinea pigs, and golden hamsters' glomeruli are not fused. And so they go on to describe the positions that we talked about. The double innervation, just like they were describing, of the coccygeal body is performed by nerve fibers along the pre-coccygeal sympathetic anastomosis. Anastomosis is just term for redundant amounts of blood vessels. So you have the sympathetic, which is the ganglia trunci sympathetic, and the parasympathetic, the plexus iliacus. There's these nerve bundles associated with the body of this organ. Coccygeal bodies are innervated not only by the cholinergic system, but also the adrenergic system. So you think of acetylcholine and you think of adrenaline. It seems that such innervation is more intense when epithelioid cells are present. Concerning the content and extremely high concentration of acetylcholine in the human glomerula coccygeae has been reported, and a similar substance seemed to exist in glomulus organ of other species. So, wait a minute. This tiny little thing that's sitting at the base of your spine that is referenced multiple times in the esoteric and yoga/tantric literature has massive amounts of acetylcholine in it. Permit me a digression here. So what is the sympathetic ganglia that we just referenced? It's the sympathetic ganglia, or paravertebral ganglia, are autonomic ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system. So that's the fight or flight system for those that are familiar. They're afferent and efferent nerve cell bodies that run along either side of the spinal cord. Afferent nerve cell bodies bring information from the body to the brain and spinal cord, while efferent nerve cell bodies bring information from the brain to the spinal cord. And if you look at this image, what does that look like to you? Thinking back to the anatomy of the esoteric occult man thing, what sort of image are we recreating here with this Gray's Anatomy illustration? This is not what it actually looks like in your body, by the way. They are located just ventral and lateral to the spinal cord. The chain extends from the upper neck down to the coccyx, forming the unpaired coccygeal ganglion. Pelvic portion is situated in front of the sacrum, consists of four or five small sacral ganglia. Each ganglion within its chain is either cervical, thoracic, lumbar, or sacral. Preganglionic nerves form the spinal cord synapse and affect the visceral organs in the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavity. Upon leaving the sympathetic chain, the fibers enter the less myelinated gray ramus communicans. There is a myelin sheath present just in far lower amounts compared to the white ramus. This enters the spinal nerve and is sent to the synapsing target, or becomes a visceral branch to enter a plexus directly on the target. Travels directly up the length of the spine, and the other plexus is the iliac nerve plexus here. So you can see this differentiation out here. So true nerve supplies that run their way up the chain of the spinal column. If you look at the prefrontal cortex during sleep, 2002 paper, you can see, the URL above. This is all retrieved from Google Scholar, by the way. We know the neural basis of REM sleep has been found to result from interaction of aminergic, and cholinergic neurons in the brainstem. So anything that's releasing acetylcholine, which we know there's high levels of it present at the base of the spine, is impacting the brainstem. Thus, although the brain activation during waking is associated with noradrenaline, which we talked about adrenaline, and acetylcholine, brain activation during REM sleep is exclusively cholinergic. So in other words, a dump of acetylcholine is taking place when you're in rapid eye movement sleep, the type of sleep that you go into when you're dreaming, although the dopaminergic system appears to be continuously active through the cycle. The neuromodulatory status of non-REM sleep is intermediate between the two. Non-REM sleep involves vigorous hippocampus, cortical, and cortico-oscillatory activity. They may have an important role in processing of learning and memory. When it comes to the neurochemistry of hypnotic suggestion, there are multiple different proposed mechanisms about what makes a person more suggestible. They're a powerful tool for studying suggestibility and dissociative states, physiology, and we do have sparse attention on opioids and acetylcholine that we've just been talking about, as well as nitric oxide. So we know there's this association between these things, and obviously they reference dopamine, and they reference glutamate, and they reference GABA, and then they reference oxytocin. So oxytocin secreted during, sexual activities, obviously different with other things, and serotonin. So all the normal culprits, but we know it's also associated with acetylcholine.
Just to go back and highlight this to make sure we didn't miss it, in a particular method for producing temporary models of pathological systems, we've seen a manipulation of hypnotic analogs. Numerous researchers have highlighted links between hypnotic suggestibility, in other words, your ability to be susceptible to hypnosis or controlled by hypnosis, and dissociative psychopathology. So what's dissociative psychopathology? States that predict psychological pathologies that make you disassociate more, that make you disconnect from reality more, make you more susceptible to being hypnotized. It has been proposed that hypnotic suggestibility confers predisposition to dissociative disorders, and multiple lines of evidence indicate that these disorders are characterized by elevated hypnotic suggestibility. So what does that mean? That means that if you can traumatize people with specific acts that are particularly traumatizing, namely things like sexual assault or aggressive sexual acts, non-consensual acts, and dare I even say anal penetration, then you are going to predispose people, particularly if they are of younger ages, to dissociative disorders, and thereby predispose them to states of hypnotic suggestibility. I know this is scary. I know this is harsh. I know people are not going to like hearing stuff like this, and they're immediately going to resist it. Sorry, the information is there. There's a reason you keep seeing these things over and over and over again.
And they mentioned dopamine as well, which dropped significantly, as well as epinephrine, norepinephrine, and adrenaline when this organ was removed. And acetylcholine, once again, 2002. In cortical inference, so you think of the cortex of the brain that we're talking about, acetylcholine plays an important role in a wide variety of cognitive tasks, such as perception, how you perceive things, selective attention, associative learning, and once again, memory. Based on these insights, we develop a theory of modulation. We propose that acetylcholine levels reflect the uncertainty associated with top-down information and have the effect of modulating the interaction between top-down and bottom-up processing and interpreting the appropriate neural representation for inputs. What does that mean? There's a certain level of ambiguity with how information is going to be processed, okay, right? I mean, you can submit the same series of facts to an individual, and based on a number of factors, the way that it's going to be perceived, the context in which it's presented will differ, correct? So it modulates this effect in how you interpret these inputs. We show that cholinergic modulation of contextual information leads to appropriate perceptual influence. Choline modulates the context of information. Neuromodulators such as acetylcholine, dopamine, and norepinephrine, all of which we've associated with this organ, concerns control of plasticity. So that's how malleable your brain is. The other most studied in invertebrate systems concerns the control of network responses. Neuromodulators alter excitability of individual neurons and amplitudes of synaptic potentials. They've also been brought together in experimental studies, and the control of plasticity is recurrently connected neural networks. This work sits with that on dopamine and its specific roles for neuromodulation. Okay. It has this role in interpretation of information and how this is incorporated into your thinking. Lesion studies in classic conditioning tasks. So we've looked at lesions multiple times at this point in both the relationship and transsexual lectures and have shown that this modulates sexual behavior. Okay, we saw lesion studies that in fact resulted in rapid onset hypersexuality. We saw lesion studies that resulted in rapid onset homosexuality. We saw lesion studies that resulted in seizures that resulted in rapid onset transsexuality and reversal of transsexuality. So as it relates to these concepts, we do have a basis for looking at this here. Lesion studies in a classical conditioning task provide additional insight into acetylcholine's role in the cortex. So in other words, they did research where they selectively brain damaged parts of the brain and looked at how exposure to acetylcholine affected people with that. Animals are known to learn faster about stimuli whose consequences remain uncertain. Through an extensive series of selective lesion experiments in rats, Holland and his colleagues have demonstrated cholinergic projection from the nucleus basalis magnocellularis to the parietal cortex is essential for this sort of faster learning. You don't need to know all those brain regions. All you need to know is that acetylcholine is dumped in these uncertain situations, okay? Or you could potentially think of them as stressful situations. These data have been interpreted using a theoretical viewpoint as implying that acetylcholine signal reports the familiarity of the stimuli or the uncertainty in its predictions. We present a theory of cholinergic function based on combining the physiological evidence that acetylcholine can differentially modulate, so it can change the way that transmission of signals carries information about theoretical ideas. Perception involves inferring the most appropriate representation for sensory inputs. This influence is influenced by both top-down inputs, so in other words, higher level reasoning, conscious awareness, top-down, providing context, and bottom-up sensory inputs from processing, as above, so below. Right? We propose that acetylcholine reports on the uncertainty associated with top-down information and has the effect of modulating the relative strengths. Many cognitive functions affected by acetylcholine levels can be recast in the conceptual framework of representational inference. Okay, so it sounds super technical, but what we're saying is what? Acetylcholine dumps are going to change your ability rapidly to perceive certain stimuli and your interpretation about events going on in the world. So, and they look at three pieces of this HMM
the hidden Markov model. That's what they're proposing, okay? We don't care as much about that. What we do care about is the overall state of the environment at the time, which we also call context. And they list out all these variables. So the context that they're referring to is your external environment world, and acetylcholine has the potential to change your perception. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see why this could be utilized if this quote-unquote organ is being stimulated? Do you see why? Again, I'm not trying to be obnoxious here. I just went through a bunch of, technical stuff, and I want to make sure I'm not completely losing people here, because I get that this jumping around certainly doesn't help my ability to convey this information, but I do want to hammer this home over and over again, what it is we're actually looking at here. We have animal studies on the brain, acetylcholine, and memory. Working memory would refer to information that changes from trial to trial. A decrease in choline functions leads to differential impairment of working memory. Rats trained in this task and given scopolamine showed a specific increase in working memory error. And we know that, guess what happens in sexually abused people? Well, they're more prone to suggestibility in a lot of cases. Cortisol levels in trauma children who reported more dissociative tendencies were associated with increased memory error. Cortisol level and trauma symptoms were not associated with increased error for children who reported fewer dissociative tendencies. Sexual and/or physical abuse predicted greater accuracy. The study contributes important new information on the studies of understanding of maltreatment, psychopathology, and eyewitness memory. So there is this dissociative principle, but it's not being consistently observed with the trauma. In other words, you have people that sort of hyper remember it, and then you have people that disassociate from it. Childhood sexual abuse, disassociation, and adult self-destructive behavior. So they looked at all of these potential self-destructive behaviors. The CSA group had significantly higher mean scores on all indices of self-destructive behavior and on both measures of dissociation. One or both dissociative measures were related significantly to each index of self-destructive behavior. We know that there's these problems with sexual abuse, which can take on a variety of forms. What's difficult to bridge the gap on, and that I'm unwilling to continue to look at in any more significant detail, is the method of administration of the sexual abuse, namely, let's say, the entry point by which it's taking place. Okay, if you catch my meaning about what it is we're talking about here, if there are significant differences as it relates to performing the act in that way, in a way that would come into physical contact with this ganglion that we're referencing versus not. I would argue, and I think it to be the case, that yes, this is probably the case, that it is in fact more disassociative and more traumatic than other entry points, and seems to be a different approach. And if you look at the Aleister Crowley stuff and his preference in his own works for citing it's preferable to have an intelligent young male as the receiver of whatever action it is that takes place, I think there's a reason that they prey on young boys. And I think that there's a reason that you see many, many times over these individuals who often have homosexual mentors from a very young age. In case you don't know who this person is, this is Roy Cohn, and I'm guessing that you know who the person on the right is. It's interesting how many of these individuals with homosexual mentors and alleged potential activities wind up resulting in positions of power, and how frequently often you see the act of sodomy alluded to, referenced, or insinuated in many of these rites that are conducted in these secret societies, given the things that we've looked at thus far. So as alarming and uncomfortable as some of this stuff might be, people need to be aware and then once they're aware, you don't need to continue to pursue and look into this stuff too deep because it's not good for you to dwell on this stuff for extended periods of time. But you need to be aware that there's stuff going on here, and whether or not this functionally is actually resulting in what these people purport to be taking place. This organ of Lushka has been around since 1869, and the amount of medical literature on it, given its strange association, over 20 years ago, we pull up a paper, and its strange association with all these powerful compounds, and its interconnectedness with the sympathetic nerve system, and it's seated right there at the base of the spine, exactly where all these Kundalini, Kabbalah, Masonic traditions predict it to be. And I find it hard to believe that nobody thought to conduct a significant amount of studies on this region that's so potentially easily susceptible to physical contact than have been conducted at this point in time. So we're going to move on from this, but I just wanted to add that context to the discussion for all these people saying there's nothing to this. There's definitely something to this.